Let's begin now.
Well, hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this third installation in the online discussion series, Count the Cost, Caribbean Life Information Forum and Exhibition. My name is Philippa Davies, Attorney at Law and Advocacy Officer for the Jamaica Coalition for a Healthy Society, and I am your moderator for this evening's discussion. Now, the topic of abortion has taken center stage in Jamaica in recent years, with the pro-legalization campaign being spearheaded by Member of Parliament Judith Cuthbert-Flynn, who is also now Junior Minister in the Ministry of Health and Wellness. And there is also the release just last month in February of a report recommending legalization of abortion by a local policy think tank, the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI. Now, as one of the many responses to the many falsehoods being advanced by the pro-abortion campaigners, this series on the Untold Cost of Abortion aims to educate the public and government officials across the Caribbean about the physical, social, mental, economic, and spiritual ramifications of legalizing abortion. And we hear from experts as well as testimonies and research and experience of pro-life regional and international partners. Now, when we began on February 27, our first session looked at the social cost of legal abortions. Then last week, we looked at the medical dangers of abortion. And this week, we'll be looking at the cost to freedom of conscience. Does legalizing abortion improve freedoms and autonomy? And we're very pleased to have several speakers to share with you this evening. We'll be hearing from Miss Alethea Williams from the Society for the Protection of the Unborn Child in the UK. Then we'll speak with Dr. Rebecca Oas, who is Director of Research at the Center for Family and Human Rights in Washington, USA, followed by Mr. Jonathan Alexandra, an attorney at law with Liberty Counsel, also in Washington, USA. And then we'll hear testimonies from two doctors who will talk about their experience where freedom of speech is concerned. Dr. Leandro Lastra from Argentina and Dr. Bogdan Chazan from Poland. Our discussion this evening will be a mix of live discussion and interviews as well as pre-recorded interviews. But we're so glad that you are with us. Of course, you can post your questions in the YouTube channel and we will be happy to discuss them and hear your opinions on what's going to be shared this evening. But I'm first going to begin with our pre-recorded interview with Miss Alethea Williams from the Society for the Protection of the Unborn Child. So I'm going to now share that screen and please do take good notes of what she has to say. So for this session, viewers, listeners, we have with us Miss Alethea Williams. She's the Campaigns and Parliamentary Assistant for the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, SPUC, and they're based in the United Kingdom. And they're actually the world's oldest pro-life campaigning and educational organization, having been founded in 1967. So we're very grateful to have Ms. Williams with us today. Thank you so much for making time to speak with us.
Hello, it's really nice to talk to you today.
Great. So if you could briefly just share what is the work of SPUC?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we are one of the oldest campaigning organisations in the world. We were actually set up to oppose the 1967 Abortion Act when it was going through Parliament. So we're primarily a campaigning organisation, so we work at the political level. Obviously, initially it was fighting the bill when it came in. Clearly, we did not succeed at that, but since then it's been fighting any expansion of abortion. It's been responding to any bills that come up, and obviously trying to move back to a situation where we have a culture of life. So our big strength is that we're a membership organisation. So we have lots of members all throughout the country, tens of thousands of members. And so when things come up, we call upon those members to campaign. So if there's a bill in Parliament, we'll contact our supporters, ask them to write to their MPs, ask them to write to their local papers, just really putting on pressure that way. Obviously, over the years, what we do has expanded somewhat with other threats to human life. So we also campaign against euthanasia and abuse of embryos. That comes up as well.
Right. Thank you. You mentioned the exceptions in the law. Is it that abortion is not completely legal in the UK? What is the scenario? What is the situation under your law right now?
Yeah, so it's quite a tricky in some ways, because obviously we have a very long law, being a common law society. So there were various laws passed in the Victorian ages which prohibited abortion. And what happened in 1967 was an amendment was made to those laws allowing abortion in some circumstances. So what it technically does is says that the doctor would not be in criminal trouble if he performs an abortion under a certain set of circumstances. So actually the letter of the law is quite strict. If it was followed, we would not have very many abortions. But what's happened is one of these exceptions is that the mental health of the woman would suffer more than if she had the baby, which I'm sure you can tell is a very subjective thing. And actually, it doesn't really go with any evidence. But what now happens is something like 97, 98% of all abortions in the UK are done under that ground. So the doctor just ticks mental health. He or she doesn't even have to specify what this mental health might be. It's just what it is. We know for sure that that's completely abused. When there's been kind of recordings of the calls between the woman and the abortion provider, they'll say what their reason is, which can be, it might be family problems, it might be something very trivial. The abortion provider will go, well, I'll just put that down under ground C, mental health. So there's very few reasons, there's very few situations where a woman would not get an abortion if she wants one. Now, that ground is up to 24 weeks. So the general law is abortions can happen up to 24 weeks, except for there's the case of disability. That's another ground where if the baby has a disability or a suspected disability, because you don't have to prove it, then abortion can happen up to birth.
Well, that's a very important point that you made, Ms. Williams. I'm glad you did, because in Jamaica, where we're now faced with the campaign to legalize abortion, and our law is from 1864, equivalent in the UK, where it is prohibited completely. There are no exceptions. And the arguments that we hear from the pro-abortion campaigners is to make an exception in the case of rape or incest and health of the mother. And here you're saying that your law is strict, but it has been so abused that health has been given this wide interpretation, then it is as if there are no exceptions. So that's very important for us to understand that the exceptions will be abused if it is allowed. Are there any statistics that you can share with us about the numbers of abortions that are taking place?
Yeah, so since 1967, there's been about 9.5 million abortions now in the UK. So we're seeing. Sorry, that's all together.
Okay.
So that's since 1967. So we see about 200,000 abortions now every year. I mean, last year was actually the highest number on record, and mostly they are just going up. I mean, I know it's always said that legalizing abortion doesn't mean there's any more abortions, or prohibiting it just means people seek unsafe abortions. But that's just not what's happened anywhere in the world. We have 200,000 abortions every year. I mean, we don't know for sure how many illegal abortions there were before 1967, but I don't think anybody would claim it was anything like 200,000. It would have been small numbers. And we've seen all over the world that people use statistics to their advantage, to try and push this. If we go to the case of the United States, one of the people who pushed for abortion in the United States has said on record, because he converted, became a pro-lifer, that they were making up numbers of the numbers of illegal abortions that were happening. He was saying that 100,000 women are dying every year from illegal abortion. It was completely made up. It wasn't true, and I think that happens a lot. I'm interested that you say they're asking for an exception for rape, because that's something that sort of came up in Northern Ireland recently. So Northern Ireland, a bit of the UK, but has until very recently has not had an abortion because of different political situations, different religious situations. And there was, when they were bringing in this new law, people were looking at having an exception for rape. And what they found, I think understandably, that's something that's very difficult to do, because you'd have to then prove that a woman has been raped. And obviously in that kind of situation, you don't want to be kind of forcing a woman to prove it or anything like that. So I think they found that is unworkable. And what they've just done is had abortion for any reason up to 12 weeks. And I think that's what generally happens. You can't really have an abortion law based around rape or incest, because, how could you prove it? You shouldn't prove it. It's not really moral to try and prove it. So what you end up having is just a blanket rule that would cover that.
Thank you so much. And the gentleman you spoke of in terms of the fabrication of statistics, for our viewers, that's Dr. Bernard Nathanson, who was called the abortion king in the US. But he did repent of what he had done and spent the rest of his life trying to undo the evil that he had facilitated and became very much a pro-lifer. Thank you so much, Ms. Williams. Let's talk about something that happened in the early months of COVID last year in 2020, where the government sought to facilitate home abortions by permitting women to take pills at home. Can you just tell us a little bit of what happened with that policy directive?
Yes, so that was very dramatic. So yes, in March last year, almost a year ago now, it suddenly appeared on our Department of Health's website that doctors could, so they made it so that doctors could send women abortion pills in the post. So normally women have to go into a clinic where two doctors, at least officially, have to approve an abortion. So suddenly it came up that women didn't have to go in and that doctors could prescribe from home and they could do it over telemedicine. So there was some strange to and froing about this. It went up on the website, then it came down again, and the Department of Health said it was a mistake and this wasn't happening. And then in Parliament, a spokesman for the government said that it wasn't happening. And then within a few days, it was approved again. So we've had this situation now for the last year where a woman can call up the abortion provider, have a scripted kind of conversation, get the abortion approved, the abortion pills, the 2 pills are sent to her in the post, and then she self-administers that abortion at home. So we've been campaigning about that for the last year. We've seen all sorts of problems with it. We feared all sorts of problems, and those have come true. And there has now been a government consultation on this, which has just ended. So we're waiting to see what the government says. So sorry, I should say that this was supposed to be a temporary policy for COVID, but this consultation was on making it permanent. So that's the fear, is what's going to happen next.
What are some of the other problems that you feared that actually were realized?
Yeah, so there's been all sorts of things happening with it. So the government imposed a limit of 10 weeks on these pills by post abortions because medical abortions are only supposed to go up until about 10 weeks. So some say a bit later, but certainly not much later. So we've seen cases of women being sent these pills later in pregnancy, sometimes much later in pregnancy. There are a few really horrific cases in the press. A 28-week baby dying, a newborn baby. So really, like, that's over our normal legal limits and a long, long way over this 10-week limit. And we've since seen more statistics showing that this has happened a fair amount. It's also really impossible to regulate. So that's one of the things I first thought when this happened. How do you regulate this? And the answer is that you can't. So a colleague within the pro-life movement here did a mystery client investigation where women who were not pregnant, but volunteers, were calling up these abortion lines, giving false names, false pregnancy. Well, obviously they weren't pregnant, so all the information was false. And they went through this safeguarding interview, and all of those women received the pills, even though they weren't pregnant and they weren't real women in that sense. And some of the personas that these women were playing were being over the limit. They still got sent the pills. Some of them were acting out that they were being coerced. So having an abusive man next to them, making them say what they were going to say, and they couldn't pick up on that. And again, that was one of the things that we feared would be the case, and we think is that it just makes it so easy for abusers. When all you have to do is ring up, the abuser can force the woman to do that, and he can force her to take the pills. There's just no way of knowing. I mean, we're not defending what the law is like anyway, but at least before telemedicine, women would have to go into the clinic and they would be seen alone, so that however bad things were, you couldn't have the abusive man or whoever sitting next to her making her have the abortion, which now can happen. Obviously, it's not something we can really get statistics on at this stage, but there's been a huge spike in domestic abuse with all the lockdowns, people being stuck in their homes. So it's just inevitable that this will have happened. I mean, there are a few cases we've heard of. I could read out a quote from a woman who reported this to the Daily Mail. So, well, this woman actually it's not that she was coerced to have the abortion, but because she was in an abusive relationship, she ordered the pills, got them very quickly. And she suffered really badly physically from the pills. She said, the next day I felt really sick, faint and dizzy. I'm still bleeding even now a few weeks on. And this is the key point. Because my partner is here and doesn't know what I did, I've not been able to ring anyone for advice. So that's one of the other fears, that women would be stuck at home with only the abuser going through this awful situation. And as she said, this woman couldn't call anyone for help, even though there were complications and it had gone wrong. She said the pain was unbearable. I was lying on my bathroom floor, curled in a ball. I was sweating. My temperature was 39.8. I couldn't move. I had diarrhea. I was being sick. I was shivering, shaking, sweating. I thought I was going to die. And this kind of leads me on to the next point, that, these abortion pills, it's not just take a pill and the baby goes away. The women do have to pass the pregnancy. It can be a really, really traumatic experience. Even if there's no abuse going on, going through that by yourself in your home, then your home is the scene of what's happened. Just the mental health implications for women are going to be terrible. And we've already seen some women coming forward and saying that. So
yes, thanks for sharing.
We thought this would happen, and it is.
And it did. Thanks for sharing that, Alicia, because here in Jamaica, the pro-abortion campaigners present this as completely a woman's issue and important for upholding women's rights and her freedom and her choice and her body, and how this is empowering. But the reality, as you're painting, and as we pro-lifers would know, that it is far from the truth. That the woman who is making that decision or trying to figure out what decision to make is in a situation of desperation or crisis or confusion. And as you say, abortion is enabling the abuser to get away with this abuse and cover up if there is a crime taking place, covering up the evidence of that crime. But then the pro-abortionists would say, well, what's your alternative? She is in a situation of need and crisis. What's your alternative? So you are a society for upliftment of life. What do you say and have done to say that this is the alternative to that woman or to that girl in that situation of crisis?
Yeah, I think it is always, we do always have to be very aware that these are real women we're talking about. These are often real crises, and the pro-life community always has to come together and make sure that there are alternatives for these women. It's not something we're directly involved in. So as I said, we're a campaigning organisation, but there are other caring organisations in this country. And we always campaign for the rights of pro-lifers to help women. So I think another big thing that's the case here is, so we will have, there are pro-lifers who will pray outside of abortion clinics and offer help to these women. And there's been a big move in recent years to try and stop this happening, to impose so-called buffer zones around abortion clinics. So even when women begin with this, being offered this last-minute help, the abortion lobby doesn't want that to happen. And I think it's just important. Yes, you mentioned very much so that a lot of women are coerced. We have a sister organisation called ARCH, which is the Abortion Recovery Care and Helpline, where women who have suffered abortion call up and get counselling. So that's kind of our big caring ministry that we do, because there's so much suffering after abortion. And as pro-lifers, we have to be there not just for women in crisis, but we also have to be there for them afterwards. Once they've had the abortion, it's not about judging women. It's about recognising that many of them are suffering. Many of them didn't know what they were going into, and they do need help and healing. And my colleague from ARCH thinks that about 75% of the women who contact them experience some form of pressure or coercion, and they don't always realise it. I think, when you think about forced abortion, you think of someone being kind of frog marched in and held down on a table, and most of the time it's not like that. What it is that the man in her life, the father, isn't supportive. He might not even realise he's not being supportive a lot of the time. Sometimes even saying, "Oh, it's your decision," that sounds supportive, but isn't, because that means that's all on the woman. Right. He's not there saying, "Yes, I will look after you. I will look after my child." Or it might be the girl's mother saying, "Oh, no, you're too young. This can't happen." So a lot of it could be sort of well-meaning and not what we think of as coercion, but it is. And there's all sorts of studies, suggesting that. So I think there's one study, it's like 64% of women questioned feeling pressure to abort, and Even the Guttmacher Institute in the US, which is a pro-abortion institute, indicated that 30% of women who have abortions because someone else, not the woman, wants it. Obviously we can't claim that this is always the case, but it is a lot of the time.
Right.
And so much of what we hear of women coming out of abortion clinics is, not, this is my empowering choice. And I don't really believe that any woman thinks that. But so many of them say, I didn't have any other choice.
That is it.
So I think we just need to fight this idea that there aren't other choices, and as pro-lifers do all we can to provide them.
Right. Thank you. What are women told, though, by the abortion providers as their counseling? Are they told the physical and emotional effects that are attendant on going through an abortion? What exactly are they counseled on, are you able to say?
I mean, I don't think that they're told very much. I mean, what we hear so much when women coming out is that they were not told. I mean, I think legally they do have to give some of the medical detail, but I don't think anything can quite prepare people for it. And you just don't hear of women going on to adopt or keep their babies much from going out there. And some of this counselling is so it's so quick. Particularly the case now we have this telemedicine. It's just a scripted call. They just go through it. It doesn't leave space. And actually a few years ago, even before the telemedicine came in, there were revelations that women were being signed off as giving consent after a phone call, sometimes of only like half a minute long. Well, I think the Daily Mail said 22-second phone calls.
Wow.
So it can be very quick, and I just don't believe that women are having that time. And something I think that the pro-abortion lobby like to say is that, once a woman's made her decision, that's it, she's made a decision. That's why they say they're so against people outside clinics. And, I don't think as women, we're not any different from men in that there's lots of factors in our lives. People don't just often make a decision which nothing else can influence. They're often very confused. There's a lot of ambivalence. There's all sorts of things that can be going on.
Right.
So I think this idea of the kind of empowered woman who's made her decision actually just is not reality, and it does a disservice to women who actually need that space to talk and perhaps be offered other help.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions. Could you say something about the targeting of disabled babies or babies suspected to have some sort of disability or fetal abnormality? How is that being treated under your law and actually in fact in the UK?
Yes, so one of the exceptions which allows abortion in the UK is if there is disability or suspected disability. And because this law was passed in the 1960s, the language is not such that we would usually use today. It talks about a baby being severely handicapped. But I do think, yes, and so it is the case that something like 99% of babies with Down syndrome are aborted. The numbers for babies with spina bifida and other problems are similar. And babies can be aborted for things like a cleft palate or club foot. And I think it does really show contradictions in society, because we do quite often now have campaigns, particularly on behalf of the Down syndrome community, pointing out these hypocrisies, because obviously generally in society there's a big move to be accepting of people with disabilities and making sure everything is accessible, and that's all wonderful. But when you point out that there is this contradiction that abortion is allowed up to birth for that, whereas it's 24 weeks for other types of abortion. Up to birth, yeah. Wow. There's no limit. The 24 limit doesn't apply. Week limit doesn't apply. And what the pro-abortion lobby will say is, well, you sometimes don't pick up these fetal abnormalities in time for the 24-week limit. And I think one of the most disturbing things about it is that it's often presented as being a compassionate choice. You shouldn't bring a baby into the world that's like that. I don't want my baby to suffer. I think there's still a lot of, ignorance in the medical establishment, because we hear so often that women, families, when they receive a diagnosis of Down syndrome, particularly, that's the one that's most highlighted, they're not told the full picture about Down syndrome. They're often just kind of pushed along this abortion pathway, going, okay, here's your diagnosis, you know, I can book an abortion for next week for you. And obviously that there are challenges with having a baby with disabilities, but they're not hearing, you know, that people with Down syndrome can live long lives and bring so much joy to their families and are happy. So there has been a big push to have more balance on this. But, you know, given that the numbers of the percentage of babies with Down syndrome being aborted is still so high, I don't think that it's really coming through. So it is this real hypocrisy in society that that any attempts to kind of equalize the law does not go down well.
And have you had cases where the doctor said there might be, or said that there is a finding of Down syndrome, but the parents decided to go ahead with the pregnancy and the baby was born normal, fine, there was no illness?
I mean, I can't think of any particular examples, but this happens all the time. You know, every few weeks you'll get a kind of, you know, tabloid headline going, I was told to abort my baby 10 times and look, now she's wonderful.
Right.
It's so
the
common.
Doctors are wrong. The doctors can be wrong.
They are wrong. I mean, doctors aren't gods. You don't always know. These tests aren't completely accurate. They only give a risk factor of Down syndrome or whatever the condition is. And there has been campaigning not to talk of it as a risk factor, like there's not a risk if there's a chance. You know, it's all about the language you use. If you tell a parent there's a 90% chance, 90% risk that their baby has Down syndrome, that instantly sounds like something bad, something that should be avoided, something that you ought to do something about.
Right. Well, Ms. Williams, thank you so much. Before you go, Priva, just tell us where persons can get more information about SPUC and any final words or recommendations that you'd like to leave with us.
Yes, so you can go to our website, which is just www.spuc.org.uk. We're on social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, so do look up any of our stuff. Thanks so much for having me on, and all the best with your fight over there in Jamaica. And fight the good fight. It's always worth it.
And is there anything that we can pray for you, for your organization, issues that you're dealing with right now that we can lift up in prayer for you as well?
Yeah, definitely. If you can pray for this home abortion situation. So the government has been running a consultation on making this permanent. We've had people responding to it, but now the government will be preparing their report. So just pray for real wisdom there and a turning back of this policy, which is so bad for women and so bad for babies.
Yes, it is. Well, thank you so much, Ms. Williams, and the Lord continue to strengthen and fortify you and your organization in this fight for life. Thank you so much for what you do.
Thank you so much. God bless.
God bless. Bye-bye. Okay, viewers, so there you're hearing from the reality in the United Kingdom that has legalized abortion, well, under certain exceptions, with certain exceptions for 54 years now. And it's very important for us to test the claims being made by the pro-abortion campaigners in Jamaica and the recommendations out of the Capri report from what has happened in the UK. The pro-abortion campaigners locally say that there should be exceptions only, abortion only for rape and incest. But we see here from the UK experience that those exceptions are abused and the door really pushed open to abortion and beyond a certain period of time, beyond the 22-week limit. And then Capri is making recommendations for minors to access abortion without parental consent and knowledge, and counseling to be provided. But here we hear that the counseling is really, there's no real counseling. There's no real truth being given to women about the real effect and what abortion is. So let us test the claims and judge for yourself whether legalization would achieve the goals that the campaigners want or what the reality is based on the UK experience. But we're going to hear from in the States as well now, and also what is happening at the international level in the UN, what sort of discussion about abortion and what sort of policies are being pushed on countries through the international arena. And to speak to us on this is Ms. Rebecca Oas, who is Director of Research at CFAM, Center for Family and Human Rights, and she specializes in looking at issues affecting maternal health. So Rebecca, welcome. Thank you so much for making time to be with us this evening.
Thank
I'm
you.
going to hand over to you for you to tell us what's happening at the international level.
Sure, just I'm putting up my slides.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Let's see. Okay, can you see that all right?
I can do that. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It is a privilege to be speaking with you, and thank you for all the great work that you're doing in the Caribbean. I will happily make my slides available. I'm going to move somewhat quickly. There's a lot in here, but happy to discuss after if you have questions. So my organization works on life and family issues at the United Nations and international institutions. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what we've been seeing with regard to abortion policy at the UN. So there is no international human right to abortion. And it's very important to say that at the beginning. There is not, there never has been. Abortion policy first entered the United Nations in 1994 at the International Conference on Population and Development, which was held in Cairo, Egypt. And there was a big attempt to create an international human right to abortion, and this was blocked and a compromise was reached, where abortion laws were determined to be something for national governments to decide. And insofar as it is legal, abortion should be provided safely and accessibly. Obviously, safety here applies not to the child, but only to the woman. That abortion should never be promoted as a method of family planning, and that governments must help women avoid abortion and provide alternatives to them. So ever since that consensus was reached, and for a quarter century, that has held, at least as far as the General Assembly, where all the nations gather. But as you all know, I'm sure the UN is more than just the General Assembly. We often think about, like in this picture, the General Assembly where all the governments meet, but there are also a lot of different agencies and a vast bureaucracy at the United Nations. And there has been a lot of work within those expert agencies to bypass the lack of consensus and insinuate a right to abortion that doesn't exist. And this began right after the Cairo conference. In 1996, there was a meeting with the United Nations Population Fund and their women's and human rights bodies, where they came up with a strategy to promote what's called sexual and reproductive health and rights, or SRHR, a term that has never been accepted or defined at the General Assembly, through the human rights treaty monitoring bodies. And then the other agencies would cite the treaty bodies and then quote each other to create this sort of echo chamber to insinuate a right to abortion. Now, obviously, this does not have the legitimacy of international consensus, and a lot of these organizations are very difficult to hold to account. So who are the treaty monitoring bodies? There are 9 core human rights treaties at the UN. On civil political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. There are treaties on the rights of women, the child, persons with disabilities, against racial discrimination, and others. And when a country ratifies one of these treaties, they then report periodically to an expert group of human rights experts from around the world. And they work in an international capacity, and they interact with the countries. They offer their observations, encouraging compliance with the relevant treaty. It's important to know that when you ratify a treaty, you are bound by the text of that treaty, but the concluding observations of these bodies are non-binding. And also, none of the core human rights treaties mentions abortion. There is no right in any of them. And the treaty bodies, which get their mandates from the text of the treaties, have no mandate to promote abortion or to attempt to establish it as a right. But the bodies associated with many of these, especially the ones highlighted in blue, have effectively gone rogue. They've exceeded their mandates and are pressuring countries very often on issues of abortion. This is just to show the fact that this is only escalating, especially in the past several years. You can see especially the CEDAW committee, that's the one that on the women's treaty, that in about 80% of national reviews, they are pressuring countries to liberalize their abortion laws. And we've seen this migrate across multiple other treaties as well, including the one on the rights of the child. And so this is a growing problem. So the content of the pressure that these treaty bodies are giving involves several things. One is to decriminalize abortion. So that is to take it outside of the criminal code entirely, both with regard to patients and providers. Also to legalize abortion for additional grounds, like our previous speaker was talking about, particularly life or health. Obviously, health gets expanded of the mother, cases of rape and incest, and of course, severe or lethal fetal impairment. And also they pressure countries on removing barriers to access to abortions where legal, where that might include needing permission from doctors or judges to get an abortion, spousal or parental consent in the case of minors, and importantly, conscientious objection on the part of medical providers. So these are just a few examples of some of the recommendations on abortion that have been given to Caribbean countries. I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but you can see they include things like the decriminalization, legalizing in specific cases, refrain from denying access, and of course, ensuring children's access to safe abortion in that last one to Haiti there. So you can see that they're covering the full range here. Looking at the Caribbean region in general, you can see that many of the countries, in fact, almost all of them in the CARICOM, the Caribbean Community geopolitical group, have been directly pressured by these treaty bodies to liberalize their abortion laws when they've ratified these treaties. I should mention too that in addition to the specific communications these treaty bodies have with individual countries, they also issued general comments or general recommendations in many cases. That sort of issue a blanket interpretation of the treaty to include rights to abortion. And obviously these are general to everyone, including the countries that they specifically target. And again, these treaty body opinions are non-binding, and that includes the general recommendations, but sometimes their opinions have been cited in national courts by activist courts as being authoritative, especially in a few Latin American countries. So that is something to watch out for at the national level. Speaking of the issue of conscientious objection, I've looked into what some of the treaty bodies have talked about as far as limiting this. The vast majority of instances, their main focus is ensuring that abortion remains accessible regardless of conscientious objection. So if you can have individuals object but still keep it available, that is a compromise they seem willing to take. However, in many cases, they're also imposing, they are urging countries to impose legal limits on the ability of individuals to conscientiously object, or to call for mandatory referral when an objection occurs. And they've also called for bans on institutional level objections to abortion. So for example, a Catholic hospital that refuses, as an institution to do abortions, or other procedures they find to be morally repugnant. I should also mention here that this issue has largely stayed focused on abortion for now, but I anticipate that the treaty bodies and other UN human rights organizations are going to be moving into other areas with the conscientious objection bans or limits, including certain assisted reproductive technologies that may require the destruction of embryos, or also transgender surgeries and therapies would be another area where we might see that. So the work of the treaty bodies has obviously been picked up and cited throughout the various different UN agencies. A couple to watch in particular are the World Health Organization and the United Nations Population Fund. Both cite the work of treaty bodies to insinuate a right to abortion. And the World Health Organization in particular issues technical and policy guidances promoting abortion as a right, but also lowering the standard of what they consider to be safe. And this gets back to the previous presentation, talking about using telemedicine, mail order pills, abortions by lower tier medical workers in the interest of expanding the pool of providers, and of course, even by patients themselves. The United Nations Population Fund, or UNFPA, claims that they don't promote or provide abortion, but they do work in partnerships with pro-abortion organizations such as Planned Parenthood, Marie Stopes on the ground. And they also, both them and the WHO, explicitly promote SRHR, which again has never been adopted or defined by member states, but is generally considered to include abortion. So I want to briefly talk about one other human rights body at the UN called the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR. This is a relatively new mechanism since 2008, and it operates under the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And its goal is basically to exert positive peer pressure on countries to comply with their human rights obligations by issuing recommendations to each other. So recommendations are given by one country to another, and the recipient will either support or note each recommendation. They tend to be like one sentence. And the good news is that abortion is mentioned in less than 1% of all the recommendations in the UPR. And recommendations pressuring countries on abortion are supported in a relatively low percentage of cases, about 30%. compared to about 73% of all the recommendations in the UPR being supported. So they're much less popular. The UPR is currently in its third cycle. In every cycle, each of the 193 countries is reviewed. You will notice that when you look at abortion pressure within the UPR, it's very regional specific. The vast majority of recommendations on abortion of pressure are coming from the Western European and others group, a lot of the wealthy countries that also fund a lot of the UN agencies as it happens. And you'll see that Latin America and the Caribbean are the majority of cases, they are the target of this pressure at this time. So just a few examples here of some UPR recommendations given to Caribbean countries on abortion. As you see, they're similar to the ones that you get from the treaty bodies. And as you'll see, sometimes they are noted and sometimes they are supported. The last one is so recent that it hasn't been responded to yet. So, but the important thing is that countries have the opportunity to register their objections by noting rather than supporting. And another bit of good news is that most countries at the UN do not promote abortion in the UPR. As you see here, the vast majority of the 193 countries, over 160 of them, have never promoted abortion in any cycle of the UPR. But obviously in a room where most people are silent, you will only hear the ones that are speaking. So it's important to issue pro-life recommendations here too. And it's also useful here to contrast what happens when experts talk to nations versus when nations talk to each other. You know, as you remember, 80% of the communications of the Women's Rights Treaty body pressured on abortion, and yet obviously countries have different priorities for human rights for each other. So I will close with just a few thoughts and recommendations. Again, to say abortion is not an international human right, but to look at a lot of the work coming out of the UN agencies, you wouldn't know that. And pro-life countries, as you're aware, are under constant pressure from these international bodies. And so there's an important need to contest the efforts to create an international human right to abortion through what's called customary international law. Basically, the more something is contested, the more people are pushing back, the less there is determined to be a norm for that. And so how do you do this? For one thing, at the UN, it's important that governments block abortion language, including euphemistic language, in negotiated documents. Resolutions that are agreed in the General Assembly are not binding on countries, but they are binding on the UN system and its agencies. And so that's where they're getting their mandate. So it's important that those documents be clean. Also important to insist on sovereignty language, reminding the UN agencies that countries and only countries have the right to determine their laws on this. If all else fails, but not at the beginning, of course, make reservations, specifying when we say this, we don't mean abortion. When recommendations on abortion come through the UPR, make sure to note them. And whenever there's a mechanism or a review to do it, hold these experts and committees and rapporteurs accountable, because being silent implies consent. And this, I'm sure, will come up in a later presentation, but also consider joining Haiti and 33 other countries in signing the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which reiterates that there is no international human right to abortion, that the family is the fundamental group unit of society, and that's what I have for now. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Absolutely. We must on every occasion and constantly say there is no right to abortion. There's no right to kill an innocent human being, most of all, the unborn child. The right to kill is incompatible with the genesis and philosophy of human rights, the doctrine of human rights. And for persons to understand the euphemisms through which abortion is being pushed, the reproductive health and rights, we must understand what these words mean, and at every occasion say that there is no right to abortion. And we must lobby our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and officials that they are there to represent the law, and our law is for life. So not only to not join with others in promoting abortion, but also speak up and say that we promote life, because this is what the law of Jamaica says. So absolutely, yes. We must. And we must also lobby foreign affairs to sign on to the Geneva Consensus, because that is what the Jamaican law says at this moment. And so there's no impediment to us signing on to that consensus. So thank you, Rebecca. And you were mentioning some of the other ways that other countries try to force us to change our laws and policies. And Jamaica has been subject to the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review.
Oh, yes.
And it's not only abortion that they're trying to push, but other aspects of the sexual rights agenda, as you say, the soft pressure that they're trying to push through those
And the treaty bodies as well.
and the treaty bodies as well. It's important to know that these are not binding. If you don't know, you hear something coming out of an international body and you're persuaded by the name United Nations, and you think, oh, Jamaica must adopt this particular position, that we're obligated. But it's for us to be informed and to know that there is no such right, and we're not bound by those recommendations. So
Right.
thank you very much, Rebecca. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let me just check with Sarah if there are any questions or comments coming in through social media.
Okay, so I do have some questions and comments on my own.
Okay.
Right. So we will actually be hosting an information session on the Geneva Consensus Declaration on April 7th. So we do invite our viewers to actually look out for this, and also our guests, you are also invited, and we will be updated. I actually did want to go into a bit more about the euphemistic language. I know Ms. Davies actually mentioned one, reproductive health rights, but for those of us who are not necessarily aware, when we read these terms, women's rights, you can go into them. Just briefly, what is the general language that the abortionist usually puts into the legal documents that might actually slip in this type of legislation into our system unknowingly to many?
Sure. Well, I can address this certainly within the UN system. At the ICPD, the Cairo Conference in 1994, the terms sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights were both included, but they were also basically defined as not including a right to abortion. They included abortion that should be safe where legal, but the legal status was to be determined by the member states. So the phrase sexual and reproductive health and rights, where that's one term together, was never included because it implies the existence of sexual rights. And that was seen as including a lot of the LGBT and other things. And, so that was rejected. So the distinction seems small, but it's important because the terms sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights are at least defined. And obviously a pro-life understanding would want better than that, because we don't want abortion to be legal anywhere. We want the rights of the unborn to be protected globally. But this was the compromise that was struck. And so oftentimes when countries are negotiating at the UN, they will say, okay, we'll agree to the term sexual and reproductive health or reproductive rights, as long as there is mention of, in accordance with ICPD, in accordance with what's been agreed at the General Assembly, to keep tying it back to that consensus so that that doesn't get eroded any further. But, under the previous Trump administration in the United States, there was a lot of efforts to push back even on that language and say we can do better than this. And so obviously the US is no longer holding that position, unfortunately, but it is very useful for other governments to take a stand and say that, we don't want to, to give room for abortion even where legal, that. And so, all of the sexual and reproductive health language is controversial, and it must remain so. It's just that there's a difference between the controversial language that's already been approved and sort of cabined to not include abortion on demand versus something like SRHR, or sexual and reproductive health and rights, which has no definition at the UN. And the definition that people tend to go to is one that was made a couple years ago by a commission of the Guttmacher Institute and the Lancet, the medical journal, which includes abortion as well as, comprehensive sexuality education and many other things that are highly controversial at the UN and at the national level.
Okay. Thank you so much for answering that question. So we just want to also invite our viewers to remember to send in their questions at the Chosen Flow Ministry Facebook and YouTube channel using the hashtag Carib4Life, CARIBFORLIFE. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you again, Rebecca, and all the best to you and your team at CFAM for the great work that you're doing in representing pro-life at the UN organizations.
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. We're going to move now to our next presenter, Mr. Jonathan Alexandra, who is an attorney at law with Liberty Counsel. It's a legal organization that specializes in freedom of speech cases. And he's senior counsel for governmental affairs. And he's going to talk to us on the topic of whose choice, legal abortions and religious freedom restrictions. Mr. Alexander, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. So as you mentioned, whose choice, legal abortions and religious freedom restrictions. So thank you for the invitation to address that. And thank you for the precision of the title. For while abortions are legal, they're never lawful. And it's important to set that out at the outset. The practice is never consistent with the laws of nature or nature's God, but it's been judicially imposed on nations, judicially imposed on the United States. But at the same time, it's also had cultural acquiescence to the practice, where the culture is in many ways complicit to promoting this practice. But even worse than that, it now seeks to ensnare those of religious convictions to participate in that same evil, despite that individual's or that entity's religious convictions against the practice of abortion. And we believe that religious liberty, the right to exercise worship, is a universal human right. That's the universal human right of exercise and expression. And so in the United States, it's a protected right, a right that ought to be free from government reach. That was the vision of the founders, as the founders enshrined it in the First Amendment. It's the vision of my organization, Liberty Counsel, as we carry on and take cases that hope to set a strong and lasting precedent of preserving exercise and expression. So contrast that fundamental right of exercise, of freedom of expression and religion, contrast that to the hedonistic, self-indulgent, murderous, opportunistic practice of abortion. This practice that is morally incompatible with the Judeo-Christian ethic, yet it's filtered its way into American jurisprudence. And now it is shackling those that have abortion promotion with those of conscience and religious and moral objections, shackling them together so that anyone that has conscience and religious or moral objections are silenced and not able to speak out against it. So that's the picture I want to create. And think of it as being a far cry from any traditional American ethic. It's not a fundamental right of abortion, and any fundamental rights that are there, including the rights of religious expression and exercise, are now being shut out because of the so-called right to abortion. It's in that very juncture where many legal battles are waged. They have varying degrees of success, and they're continuing now even as we speak. And so in the next few moments, I want you to hear these three things. The stories of the individuals and the institutions that are most affected by the forced compliance to the abortion mandates, and use those as anecdotes and experiences that have happened in America that you can take back to your country and see these are the individuals and institutions and some of the stories of folks affected. Second, the legislation and the policy that feeds the abortion compliance, and even the personnel, those that are elected to office that are feeding abortion compliance, forced abortion compliance. And lastly, the laws that are on the books and the attempts to silence any speech that opposes abortion. So first, let's talk about the individuals and the institutions most affected by abortion mandates. These are the individual doctors, nurses, practitioners, medical students. These are the people that merit first discussion because they're on the front lines. They're having the work of their hands and their very labor joined to the practice that they strongly disagree with. It's often said, and should often be said, the ethic of these practitioners is to do no harm. So already you can see it's incompatible with their ethic of doing no harm and forcing them to practice abortion. The two of them will always be at odds. And that opposition is only made stronger. It's only strengthened when that individual has a specific religious and conscience or moral objection against the practice of abortion. So not only the onus to do no harm, but a specific religious conviction that they cannot join into this practice. Now, sadly, these individuals aren't given the exemptions that they properly deserve. And those that are given those exemptions are only given those exemptions when they stand up, when they raise their head above the crowd and are willing to fight for their positions. And so to that end, I think of the nurses in 2010, 8 nurses at Nassau University Medical Center. They were disciplined when they raised their objections to assisting in the performance of an abortion. It took a strong resolve from these nurses to demonstrate to the hospital that they had a conscience and a moral right not to participate in abortion. Over time, the hospital there did issue an apology, and it said it intended to reform its practice, but that only came when the nurses decided to join together and take a stand. I think also of Kathy DiCarlo. She was a nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. In May of 2009, she was forced to participate in a late-term abortion, despite her long-standing religious objection to participating in abortions due to her Catholic belief. The hospital in that instance threatened Ms. DiCarlo with the loss of her job, the loss of her license, the loss of her livelihood if she refused to participate in the abortion. It took a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of Mrs. DiCarlo for her to pursue her rights. In March of the following year, it took an additional request to the United States Department of Health and Human Services for them to then launch an investigation to those conscience violations. All these efforts were taken so that her rights would be respected by the hospital. She had to go through many layers of authority to ensure that she would have the choice not to participate in abortion. So whose choice is it, really? It took her 3 years to resolve her case. And while the hospital eventually made changes to its policy and procedures to ensure that her and other medical personnel would not be forced to participate in abortions, it took a very long time to get there. I think of Kathy's story. I also think of Sarah Helwich. She's a young nurse, a midwife. After completing her education in midwifery, she sought employment at a Florida hospital. And during her interview, during the sit-down conversation that she had with the hiring director, she was questioned about her membership with the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists. She was questioned during that interview about her pro-life religious objections to abortifacients and birth control. She then was informed after her questioning that because she was a member of a pro-life group and because she held on to her religious convictions, she would not be allowed to proceed in the hiring process. Her choice to believe a certain way disqualified her from employment. So whose choice is it really? Sarah, Kathy, and the 8 nurses' stories are examples of individuals who have committed their lives to helping others. They're spurred by their faith, their commitment to charity. Nevertheless, their livelihood are at stake. They're threatened because of the convictions that they hold, because of their refusal to join the work of their hands into this practice that is contrary to their religious beliefs. You know, there are 3 different instances that have varying outcomes, but that just shows and demonstrates the ongoing difficulties that people of faith have while providing healthcare service in a country that has legalized abortion. And this is even in a case, these cases happen despite there being federal and state statutes that ought to exempt individuals from violating their conscience in this matter. Yet folks are forced to ask a high court or ask a court to be a backstop for their rights. And that's frankly a terrible place to be. If your rights being expressed or your rights being protected hinge on the opinions of a judge. And I make that point to say that when the discussion comes up in Jamaica, when they say, hey, we'll institute this right to abortion, but at the same time, we'll give religious exemptions and that'll act as a safeguard. Don't fall for that. It is a practice that is not satisfactory. That is a low level standard. It's a low bar that will easily be discarded. And these individuals and their testimony is evidence that it will only take a matter of time until that is completely ignored. And it's not just the individuals, it's institutions, hospitals themselves that face the same moral compromise in light of what the American jurisprudence did. It's very shaky in how the rights that are established in our jurisprudence are there to preserve the rights of individuals, but also the rights of hospitals and entities, different institutions, like hospitals receiving federal funds or health service programs, even private universities that are getting grants for research. All these institutions have been challenged by the requirements to participate in activities to which they have a religious and moral objection to if they're going to receive federal funds. So it's individuals and it's entities. I think of most of the Catholic affiliated hospitals that have an ethical and religious directives that they must abide by. It's within their faith, tenets of their faith that keep them from participating in abortion or sterilization or contraception or assisted suicide. These practices are all in direct conflict with their faith. Nevertheless, there are schemes within federal funding given to hospitals that seek to attach those federal fundings to the participation and even promotion of those aforementioned life-ending procedures. And if these hospitals or these private universities are firm in pushing back against this, they face the removal of federal funding. Federal funding, if removed, will cripple their ability to perform any medical service. So once again, these entities, just like the individuals, have a choice, right? And the choice is between violating their faith and practicing abortion or continuing funding, which is no choice at all. It is not a fair choice. And of course, in the 1970s, this problem was anticipated. 1970s, the same era where there was this judicially recognized right to abortion via Roe v. Wade. And so the government said, well, we'll set up church amendments or the Coates-Snow Amendment or the Weldon Amendment. We'll set up these amendments to put in place so that entities that are providing healthcare could still object to sterilizations, that individuals could still object to performing abortions and still receive federal funding or still keep their employment. You know, these very amendments were placed into law at the same time, and they were meant to prohibit public authorities from conditioning the receipt of federal funding with the promise that these individuals receiving the federal funding would participate in abortions and force their personnel to participate in abortions as well. But despite that being the legislative intent, despite that being the statutes on the book, these legal safeguards, despite them still being there, these legal safeguards have been impotent. Many hospitals still fall prey to participating in activities they disagree with in order to retain federal funding, or individuals participating in abortions or performance of abortions just to keep their job. Even when there are laws on the books, too many hospitals are stuck with the choice of receiving federal funds and continuing to do an activity that they disagree with. And the reason hospitals are stuck in this place are for two reasons. The first is inadequate enforcement tools. So yes, this law is on the books, but there is no potency in the enforcement of the law. The church amendments or the Weldon Amendment or the Coates-Snow Amendment, they're powerless if there's no enforcement. So this is 1970 when these are put in place, but it was not until 2018, 50 years later, that the Health and Human Service Agency in the United States decided to take a look at this, to start investigating forced violations of conscience. It wasn't until the Trump administration in 2018 that the Office of Civil Rights within HHS, the Health and Human Services, decided to have a conscience and religious freedom division in an office that would particularly pay attention to violations of conscience. And sure, I suppose in the past 50 years, there would have been a spreadsheet somewhere of these violations. There would have been a catalog of complaints somewhere, but there was no active willpower to investigate. That's all just to say, even when these laws of conscience are on the books, if there is no onus to investigate, no willpower to investigate and prosecute these things, then these laws are meaningless. Second, there's a lack of awareness. Many of these hospitals and these individuals working don't even know the protections that are in federal law. And to the extent that they have an awareness, there's confusion. And even if they're clear about it, they still have to make the choice, it's not really a choice at all, between continuing in their work or acquiescing to what they're being forced to do and participate in abortions and like services. It takes a consistent drumbeat of communication and campaigning to get these entities up to speed, to know what their rights are, but also give them the incentive to say, yes, you can in fact fight and win. Think of the many entities that have already been caught up in the torrents of forced compliance without the knowledge that they can escape or without the boldness to take a stand and fight back. Couple that with the incentive to protect rights, or the discretion of the prosecution lies at whatever power is in place. So even if these individuals or these hospitals want to fight back, the discretion still lies on whatever administration is in power as to whether or not they will enforce these laws. And that changes at the whim of whoever is in the Oval Office or whatever executive administration is in power. Basically, if you have a pro-life president, the laws that are on the books meant to protect religious choice are effective. They're used in that manner. But if you have a pro-abortion president, those laws are ignored and not enforced. An example of this is just 4 months ago. 4 months ago today, the laws were enforced by Secretary Alex Azar, who had a history of preserving conscience protections. But now, if confirmed, the individual at the helm of the Health and Human Services Agency is Javier Becerra. He was formerly an attorney general that my firm fought against. We faced him in court because he persecuted pro-life individuals. He persecuted Sandra Merrick, who was a grandmother that exposed the horror of Planned Parenthood to the world. Javier Becerra is the same attorney general that targeted the little sisters of the poor, forcing them to violate their conscience through their entity by forcing them to provide insurance that included contraceptives. That's why there seems to be no real choice for these hospitals when they want to follow their convictions on the abortion issue. The enforcement mechanism is inadequate. The hospitals may be unaware, and even the protection that is there on the books can change based on who is in office. And lastly, there's the area of speech itself. American jurisprudence has a checkered history on how it treats individuals and entities that want to speak up against the practice of abortion. For this, I think again of our client, Sandra Merritt, who I just mentioned. She's a journalist, and her investigative journalistic work exposed what happens within an abortion facility, where doctors were caught on camera bartering the sale of baby body parts. As we defended her in court, defended her courageous willingness to speak up, we were able to place on the stand an abortionist who told the court how they would place forceps on the throat and the hips of babies. They would crush above and below the abdomen in a way to preserve the organs, as many organs as they could, in order to sell them for profit. Sandra Merritt exposes. She was using her First Amendment right of freedom of the press and speech to expose the horror that was abortion. Yet she was brought up on criminal charges. She was brought up on criminal charges initially by Kamala Harris, who was the current vice president of the United States when Kamala Harris was attorney general. The prosecution was then carried forward by Javier Becerra, the current nominee for the Health and Human Services Secretary. That's the threat that befalls individuals who seek to stand up and speak against the practice of abortion. It's not to mention the cases that have made their way all the way up to the Supreme Court, where pregnancy centers who specialize in providing alternatives to abortion were forced to speak or forced to put out publications and pamphlets to their clients that these pregnancy centers are trying to rescue. They were forced to tell them that you have the option to go next door and discard your baby. And it took a Supreme Court intervention to protect those pregnancy centers and protect those individuals from that law that forced them to promote abortion. Even still in the speech context, and we heard this before happening in the UK, but it's happened here in the United States. I think of our sidewalk counselors, these individuals whose hearts are with those that are in their very turbulent times, individuals that are about to enter abortion facilities. And these sidewalk counselors are the last voice of hope, the last voice that they will hear telling them that they can keep their baby and not destroy life, telling these expected mothers that they have the resources, the support that they need to raise a baby. Well, there are laws on the books, and we fought against them, that disallow sidewalk counselors from having conversations with these mothers, literally limiting their ability to talk to them. These are challenged. These are the challenges that the objectors to abortion face, where even what you're saying is limited. And these challenges have varying legal degrees of success, whether they're in the arena of free speech, whether it's the nurses that we've mentioned, whether it's the hospitals or the entities that are receiving federal funding, or those speaking out against abortion. The choice is not really a choice at all, but it's a choice between upholding the religious convictions that you believe that puts you at odds with the abortion laws. But the fight continues, the fight to preserve life, and we're actively seeking to preserve life, shaping the culture that promotes life, reshaping the American jurisprudence to promote life. It's a continuous battle. It's fought daily in the courts. It's fought in the legislative halls. But at the same time, and I'll just mention this quickly, it's not just the laws that are already on the books, but it's legislative fights that we're currently in. There's a proposed law that's already passed by the House of Representatives. It's waiting just outside of the Senate chamber floor. President Biden has already committed to signing this Equality Act. And it's a proposed law that names pregnancy and related services as a protected class, which means those related services ought to be provided to an individual. And by related services, they mean abortion, contraception, sterilization, other related activities. If that individual is not able to receive that service by an entity, then that entity has discriminated against them in a manner that the full force of federal government can be arrayed against this entity. And for the first time in history, there is no defense to that. Previously, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, an act that was enacted specifically to protect an individual's conscience or religious rights, that act is cut out. It's literally gutted in the law. It's no longer used as a defense for individuals or entities that don't want to provide these abortion or pregnancy-related services. So this law passes, it is truly the death knell when it comes to conscience or any moral or religious protections. It is such a broad law. It applies to every entity, and not just the hospitals that I mentioned before, the ones that are directly receiving federal funding, but it applies to anything under public accommodations, which means any private hospital, any medical provider, anyone that is providing a service or a good. It's intended to do so to provide sweeping federal law enforcement against anyone who's hanging a shingle out as a healthcare provider, even if they do not want to provide abortion, sterilization, and other related activities. So my friends, to say that the legal and policy work is cut out for us and cut out for your respective countries is an understatement. But it's precisely where we ought to continue to take a stand. These laws and legislation are a reflection of our culture. So I think that's where the work needs to be done first. With talks like this, with people around your dinner table in your home, tell them of the atrocities and horrors of abortion. Commit that every time your voice is heard, that the people listening to you in that setting hear of your commitment to life and are inspired to do the same, to commit to life. And every time that choice is placed in front of you personally to hold on to your religious and moral convictions in the face of a government or a culture arrayed against you, that you have the boldness and the conviction to take a stand, knowing that you have the full weight of justice and truth on your side, despite the present difficulties, knowing that your fight is not in vain, knowing that you're fighting for a fundamental right of believing in the first universal human right, the right to life, but knowing as well that your devotion to God and the exercise and expression of your faith should not be trampled on by your government, regardless of who the government is. So my fellow panelists, the organization, and those listening, take heart. Know that the work that you're doing is important. You play a vital role in setting out the culture and the law and policy that has an impact today, will have an impact on generations, to those who will experience the joys of life because of your hard work. So don't be weary in doing good. Be aware, know the terrain that you're fighting on, but continue to take the stand for the sanctity and preservation of life.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alexandra, and for sharing some of those cases of those healthcare workers who are seeking to live by their religious convictions, but also the commitment that they made to the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And what you've shared and what Dr. Oas has shared, and also from Ms. Williams, is really quite evident that the pro-abortion campaigns are taking away our choice, the choice of the baby, of the mother, of the healthcare providers, of nations, and are imposing their choice on us to force us to legalize abortion. And they're just sweeping away, stifling, suppressing communication of the truth of what this horrific act is. And we must call it for what it is, Mr. Alexander, as you have. It is murder. We must call it for what it is and not allow it to be hidden under the euphemism of sexual reproductive health and rights or termination of pregnancy, as we hear very often in the Jamaican space, without saying exactly what kind of termination we're talking about. I know you have pregnancy and related services, so we must know what the words mean and call it for what it is exactly. And let me just let you know that in 2008, when we had the first parliamentary discussion on legalizing abortion, back in 2008, a draft termination of pregnancy act, civil act, was introduced or proposed. And they had a clause where if a doctor or healthcare professional refused to carry out abortion or refused to recommend the mother to another professional, they could be fined. And at the time, it was 250,000 Jamaican dollars, which would have been under 2,000 US now, but at the time, 10 years ago. But that is what that draft law said. If you, as a doctor or healthcare professional, do not carry out this act or refer that mother, you would be fined or imprisoned up to 3 months. So removing any possibility of a conscientious objection or that doctor holding to their oath to first do no harm. So thank you very much for sharing those cases and those experiences. Let me see, Sarah, any questions from your end?
Right, definitely. So the discussion has been really fruitful so far, but I just wanted to hone into the idea of rights. You know, we haven't even defined the term because it's such an ambiguous term. Proponents of abortion appear to, you know, they tend to sideline religious views, as was highlighted by Mr. Alexander. But we know that, you know, there is no law that is in a vacuum. There's always a worldview that underpins what our laws are. And so I would just ask the question, it's kind of rhetorical, but if anyone wants to respond, what worldview? Secular humanism or like Judeo-Christian worldview, which worldview gives the most protection and the better outcomes in society? I know some persons shy away from the religious debate, but it's really something that we can't avoid. So I just wanted to put that out there, whether anyone wants to comment or not, but just to just put that out there. There's no law made in a vacuum. There was actually one of our local medical doctors recently wrote an article published in a newspaper speaking about how why the Bible should not be used as a moral standard, and yet he is posing a worldview. There is nothing that you can't make a position without actually ascribing to something, you know. So I just wanted persons to think about these things. We're not necessarily pushing anything on anyone, but there is no position out there that protects everyone in a more equal and have wholesome outcomes as, you know, I believe the Judeo-Christian worldview on which our laws were originally based, and we do hope and pray that they will continue to be based on this worldview. And we again invite our listeners to send in your comments using the hashtag #CaribForLife.
I think you're right. I'll just address that quickly, and it's in the first history or the first recalling that we have of anything that we know of mankind, the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. I think that's, if you start at the beginning, the first stories of mankind is where you're able to find everything we need for a well-ordered society. You think of Adam and Eve's first duty, their interaction with God, their duties of worship, and then you see why it's up to nations to preserve the right of worship. You see God telling Adam, go and work and keep the garden. Within the very second chapter of the book, it says, go and work and keep the garden. And you understand that Adam is now given a responsibility to work the garden with his hands, use the labor of his hands, but also reap the reward of it. And so property, the laws of property are found there, where an individual is able to work and till the ground and get property or amass wealth from the work that they're doing. So even in the first principles of Scripture, you can already see that there is a duty of worship, there's a right to worship, but also the duty to an individual's property. And lastly, the ways of which individuals interact with one another. The code that, unspoken code that Adam had with Eve, Eve, this is how we're going to raise our children. This is how our children are going to raise their children. This is how we're going to deal with our future neighbors. This is the basis of the laws of contracts, the ability to interact within a commonwealth with individuals that are outside of yourself for the first time, looking for your interests, but also the interests of someone else. So even in the first chapters of scriptures, you can see the rights of worship, the rights of property, the rights of contract, which is the basis for any rule of law. And I, as you, dare anyone to find something outside of that framework to which any structure or any government can be upheld. And we've had experiments all throughout history of individuals that have tried to look outside of that. Hitler's Nazi Germany, where all the laws were relative, was a way of trying to look outside of that. And we see the outcomes of that. Joseph Stalin in communist Russia, the very same thing, trying to find a way outside of explaining human interaction and laws outside of the biblical mandate for it, and we saw its results. So certainly I agree with you, and I'll say that it is within the first chapter and within scripture that we find these ultimate principles, and we can't find that in secular humanism or in other worldviews.
May I add something briefly? The question, who ultimately gives rights? Is it the individual? Is it the society? Is it the government of a nation? Is it the United Nations? Or is it the creator and the lawgiver, who is God? So the basis of rights, the foundation of rights, what I am entitled to do, must come from our creator and our lawgiver. And so I agree with you that the basis of rights really is in what God has revealed in the Bible. And anything that goes against what God has required of us is not really a right that we have. So thank you again for your presentation. It was enlightening, and we're glad that you are fighting the battle over there in the United States. Take courage and continue to fight that good fight of faith.
Thank you, Mr. Buckley.
Yes, so thank you. Yes. Thank you very much. So thank you again, Jonathan Alexandra and Rebecca Oas, for your presentation, for your work. You are on the front lines, and we will keep you in your prayers. Thank you so much. And if you have to go, we'd understand as we move into the second part of our evening's presentation. So we now will be hearing from some doctors who have experienced persecution. We'll be hearing from two, one from Argentina and one from Poland, as to whether they were allowed to exercise freedom of conscience or not, and what impact that had on them.
Okay, we're now officially beginning. We are here with an esteemed medical doctor from Poland, Dr. Bogdan Chazan. He was the head of the gynecology and obstetrics department at Holy Family Hospital in Poland. As we discuss how legalizing abortion limits freedoms of conscience, Dr. Chazan has a very heartfelt story to share from his own experience practicing medicine during a time when abortion was legal in his country. Dr. Chazan, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We greatly appreciate you being willing to share with us. Firstly, before we get into your experience as a pro-life doctor, could you give our viewers a brief background about your years of experience, specialization, and qualifications as a medical professional?
First of all, I would like to express that I am grateful in Jamaica, a kind invitation to the Caribbean webinar. It's really a great honor for me. I am a physician and even professor of obstetrics and gynecology graduated a long time ago of the Medical University of Warsaw in 1968. It means that I was able to observe the situation of mothers and doctors under different abortion rules in my country. First, in the past, I worked at the National Research Institute of Mother and Child for more than 30 years as the head of clinical department of obstetrics and gynecology of this institute, as well as a national consultant in obstetrics and gynecology of Poland. But 20 years ago, I was dismissed from my post at the institute. Why? For defending the life of an unborn child. I expressed publicly the opinion that Down syndrome doesn't meet the criteria of severe disease threatening the child life, which would justify, according to our law, during that time, performing an abortion. Feminist organization filed a complaint with the public prosecutor's office, accusing me of disrespecting women's so-called reproductive rights. At the end, I was removed from my post at the institute, at the whole from clinical practice. I left my position as a scientific worker and was forced to look for another work. And after some time, I found in 2004 a new employment, this time as a director of the Municipal Holy Family Hospital in Warsaw. I started with employing there a new, well-educated, morally mature and experienced personnel. In this hospital, we didn't perform abortions and in vitro fertilization. Our patient accepted it. Oh, after some time, we received many prizes and awards. Now I work as medical director of Mothercare International, the professional non-governmental organization of Christians, gynecologists, and obstetricians. We promote the dignity of mothers, we support pro-life physicians, we provide also essential obstetrical care in Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda in Africa.
Okay, we found your story on LifeSite News, that a judge announced your dismissal from your position as head of the gynecology and obstetrics department, and you and your hospital were even given a fine after you refused to participate in abortion. Could you tell us about that experience? Take us back to that day. What exactly happened to start this persecution? Why did you decide to make a stand for life?
Yes, first about the story about this event in the Holy Family Hospital. In April 2014, it means also 7 years ago, I refused as a consultant, as a director, to perform abortion at the Holy Family Hospital. The mother has experienced many obstetric failures in the past. Her child was diagnosed with developmental defects within the school. After a long talk, long conversation, instead of an abortion, I offered the mother care during the pregnancy and birth in our hospital. I proposed also the psychological assistant and perinatal hospice. However, the patient didn't give up her plans to get an abortion. She could, however, realize her will in another hospital in Warsaw. I think that without any trouble, but she insisted for abortion just in the Holy Family Hospital. The child was born in another hospital by cesarean section, with head defects more serious than had been expected. Professor from that hospital described the child's appearance after birth in detail on television and called him a monster. or Chazan's child. He said, "This is the life Dr. Chazan protected." The baby died within a couple of weeks in the intensive care unit. A few weeks after I refused to perform the abortion, the patient filed a complaint with the city hall in Warsaw, which is the founding institution of our hospital. Immediately after, 5 simultaneous inspections were ordered that are carried out in the hospital provided by various institutions. For example, the public prosecutor's office investigated my case, but his office had ended with discontinuation decision, in spite of the announcement of one of left-wing politician that I will certainly go to prison. You have mentioned that National Health Fund find the hospital with an equivalent of about $30,000. My case of abortion refusal have been considered also at the court of the National Board of Physicians for 5 years. And in the end, the decision of its discontinuation was taken because of the expiration of 5 years. After many sessions, many reconsideration, and a number of contradictory opinions. My case is still at civil court. It is being conducted for 7 years and is still without the final sentence. Now there are going proceedings at the European Court of Human Rights against Poland, initiated by the application from a mother who was refused an abortion by myself, sitting the conscience clause. The patient demanding about $300,000 from the hospital for the suffering inflicted and is threatening with me a civil lawsuit. The case was, I remember it well, was highly publicized in the media, where it became soon a leading topic. I was ruthlessly attacked by liberal politicians and journalists. The media published articles with false information, malicious comments, and even assaults. However, a statement emphasizing the necessity to defend human life were published by Polish episcopate. In this atmosphere of hot social debate, the mayor of Warsaw, Mrs. Hanna Gronkiewicz-Waltz, commonly regarded as a Catholic, dismissed me from my position. Later in the media, she said that she shares my system of values, but she had to fulfill the requirements of the law. Whether legalizing abortion really protects freedoms? The answer is, in short, that legalizing abortion definitely doesn't protect freedom of anybody. It sometimes caused that women became a tool for some men. The babies are be treated as a parent's property, simply the object which is welcomed only if he or she come on proper time and fulfill every parent's expectation. It would also cause that doctors will lose the freedom of conscience.
Thank you very much for sharing with us again. God bless you.
Thank you.
Keep standing firm for life.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your invitation.
All right.
Right, so we have here with us an esteemed medical doctor from Argentina, Dr. Leandro Rodriguez Lastra. Dr. Rodriguez Lastra is an obstetrician gynecologist in the Rio Negro province, Argentina, and he was actually the head of gynecology services in the Pedro Mogiansky Hospital. As we discuss how legalizing abortion limits freedoms, right, of conscience, Dr. Rodriguez Lastra has a very heartfelt story to share with us from his own experience. Practicing medicine during a time when abortion was legal in his country. Dr. Rodriguez Lastra, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Greatly appreciate it.
Pleasure.
All right, so Dr. Rodriguez Lastra, he has been experiencing a number of trials for refusing to perform an abortion from April 2017. A judge actually found Dr. Lastra guilty of failing to carry out his duty as a public functionary. And he was actually even sentenced to 14 months of imprisonment, which was suspended. But before we go into, you telling us your experience, I just wanted you to give our viewers a brief background of your years of experience, your specialization, qualifications as a medical professional.
Well, I was born in Argentina 44 years ago. I am a specialist. I finished my gynecologist residency in 2014. I was chief resident in 2015. I am specialist in gynecologist endocrinology. I was taking courses on gynecological and obstetric ultrasound as well. In 2016, I decided to improve my work and career, finding this challenge 12,000 kilometers from Buenos Aires in the province of Rio Negro.
Okay. All right, so we found your story aired on several online articles, right? You had several court hearings and verdicts given in trials from 2017 and ending just recently after you refused to participate in abortion. Could you just take us back to how all of this persecution began? Like, what exactly happened to start this persecution?
Well, this persecution began with a complaint of a provincial deputy. She was the author of a law that I'm accused of having violated. And so that's how this began.
So a complaint was given, like, okay, oh, okay. So in an article I read that the woman who was brought in, she had a fever, and your first reaction was to try to protect her from having a septic abortion due to bacterial contamination. Could you tell us a bit more about this and why you believe that your intervention to save her, both her and her child, was important?
Well, that's right. The 19-year-old patient was transferred by ambulance from a neighboring, less complex hospital to the hospital where I was working in the gynecological emergency unit. The patient had a serious problem communicating. However, she told me that she had started an abortion with a treatment provided by a feminist organization. I must clarify that this organization does not act within the framework of the law. Her clinical evaluation was worrisome, not only because of her fever and tachycardia, but also because of her advanced pregnancy and because of her exposure to an unsafe abortion. The importance of my intervention is based on caring for the health, not only of the patient, her baby's health too. We were not facing an abortion in progress, but rather a threat of preterm delivery. That's very different, which means that the child immature is at risk of being born, requiring medical assistance. If the child was born, that assistance could not be denied, meaning an unnecessary risk for the child.
Okay, All right. So in addition to all the persecutions that you went through, you were denied the right of even doing your medical practice privately. Is this correct? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So
Yes,
do you
yes.
believe that it was really overreach of the law? Like, you think the law went over its bound?
Well, I need to clear. The sentence that weighs on me is not firm. That means I don't have to pay any penalty right now. If it is firm, the sentence. If it is firm, the sentence will not affect my work as a doctor, but as a public official. For this reason, also in the province, in the province of Entre Rios, here in Argentina, pressure forced a weak health minister to suspend my enrollment. This decision is certainly invalid, and that's only in one province, not in all the country. Well, you know, this is because of some pressure. It was an arbitrary decision that shows the persecution that there is towards the pro-life sectors. On the other hand, it can be assured that the law enacted at the end of the last year is definitely wrong with respect to the penalty imposed on those who supposedly obstruct access to abortion. That's not right. It's a wrong law, definitely.
So how long did the trial actually last before you finally got acquitted?
I was not acquitted. The trial is still in process.
Progress. Wow.
Well, we have gone to the Supreme Court of Justice. We hope that the members of the court will finally be able to make a proper analysis of the situation. That's our hope.
I hope so too. Okay, I just wanted to connect your experience to the Jamaican context now. So abortion activists here in Jamaica are actually pushing for abortion to be legal up to 22 weeks. And that, from my research, I found that that was around the time of the pregnancy in the case that you dealt with, and the baby weighed 500 grams and it had a heartbeat, you know, despite the woman having taken the abortion pill. But could you tell us from a medical perspective a bit more about the risks of abortion procedures at this stage?
Well, as the pregnancy progresses, the danger of abortion are greater. And that at that gestational age, there is a risk of uterine rupture and repeating bleeding and greater long-term consequences for a woman's fertility. That's just a little mention from all the complications.
Okay. All right. So proponents of abortion usually advance women's rights, but as we've seen from your experience, whose rights will prevail? So I would ask the question, like, as a Christian, will Christians or others who believe in life in the womb be punished for trying to preserve both lives? Could you comment on the issue of justice that relates to the abortion issue based on your experience?
As for justice, it is worrying that judges sentenced under pressure or by ideology, particularly in this case, where there has been ample evidence that it was a medical treatment, only medical treatment. However, the judges did not allow themselves to analyze the situation objectively, and the ideological gaze always prevailed. This situation highlights the worrying helplessness of all health personnel as well as other professions are currently affected.
So, right. I know there are cases where mothers here in Jamaica have been told by their doctors that their babies will be deformed, but the mothers delivered and the baby was actually born 100% healthy. But as a medical doctor, would you encourage mothers to persist even with the possibility of birth defects?
Birth defects are a big problem. I believe that the doctor must be absolutely sure before reporting such a diagnosis. As a doctor, I can only ask the patient one thing. If you only had a few hours to live, how much did you give to receive a hug or a kiss from your mother?
Wow, that's such a good question to ask, Right. So let us look at, medical doctors take the Hippocratic oath before practicing medicine, where they promise to preserve life. But we understand that there is really a lot of intimidation, as in your case. So what do you say to doctors who believe in the value of life but are feeling fearful if they stand for life?
Well, my message to coworkers who feel intimidated is to have their work as their moral conviction respected. Both are part of human rights, and we must enforce them despite everything. No one can force us to do what we do not want, and the foundation is completely valid. Let's fight for our rights. If we cannot do more for the right of those who cannot defend themselves.
So I had read that you are a member of a pro-life group. In English, it's called Save Both. So tell us a bit more about this and how people can support your efforts to stand for life.
Well, I joined the group from becoming aware of the reality of abortion pressures and the lie of the argument to protect women's rights and health. I believe that it is very important to take a stand in defense not only of life, but of our freedom. Supporting our efforts to defend life is as simple as taking responsibility for each of us in this defense. We must not complicit in this murderous law. Silence is complicity.
Silence is complicit. Yes, yes. All right. So my last question to you. Our Jamaica's government, the Minister of State for Maternal Health, she has actually used Argentina's abortion law as one of the standards for Jamaica to follow. You being from Argentina, I know that this would be personal to you. So our government is actually set to cast a conscience vote on the issue of whether legalizing abortion, whether they should legalize abortion or not. But as a medical doctor who has experienced persecution, perhaps even heard baby cries during procedures, what would you say to our government as they consider whether legalizing abortion would help our women and our country?
Well, I will tell to the government who are considering legalizing abortion, well, to witness the medical act that abortion implies. Not only the profuse bleeding of early abortions, but also the birth of a live fetus. How it seeks a breath that allows it to live. How the death of fetus is removed from pieces from its mother womb. I will ask them to accompany the woman who is forced to have an abortion, thus seeing that nothing is improved with the abortion, but on the contrary, the pain of having a lost baby is added. Because the woman who does not, the woman who aborts does not stop being a mother. She will be a mother of a dead child. To have women is to guarantee access to education and health. Let's not allow them to lie to us. The real achievement is avoiding pregnancy, not avoiding birth. If they tell us that they are interested in our health, let them include unborn children. They also deserve the right to live.
Yes, thank you so very much. You've said so many touching things, and I wish you all the very best as well with your upcoming cases. Thanks again for sharing with us. But just to tell our audience, one of Dr. Rodriguez Lastra's lawyers, Damian Torres, has written a book about Dr. Lastra's experience. It is entitled Cuando salvar vidas se convirtió en un delito. In English, When Saving Lives Becomes a Crime or Became a Crime. We'll place a link in the to the book in the video description, and I would encourage all Spanish teachers and students of Spanish in Jamaica and across the world to purchase a copy. So, yeah, as I said, yeah.
Let me add a little thing. The sale of the money of the book,
proceeds of the book, right?
That's right. Is used to help an organization that it is trying to save women with pregnancy, unexpected pregnancy. Oh. So they help that women with several with money or what the women need. Sorry. So it's not for money. The sale of the book is not for the money, but
for the cause.
That's right.
Okay, so
that's very important.
Yeah, just to repeat again to the viewers, so the sales of the book will be going towards helping women with crisis pregnancies.
That's right.
To help them, in that cause. So it's really a worthy cause. It's not for profit. Thanks again so much, Dr. Lastra.
Thank you for your correction about my language is not very, very good, but I did my best, and I thank you so much, and best regards.
Right. So God bless you and keep standing firm for life.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Well, viewers, there you would have heard it for yourself, the actual experiences of persons who, in the fight for life, have been targeted and persecuted by authorities because they choose to save the life of the unborn. Just understand that this abortion movement is a culture of death. It's a culture of lies. It's a culture of taking away freedom and choice of the unborn child, of his or her mother, of conscientious healthcare providers, of healthcare entities, and of nations. There is no room for accommodation of personal belief or religious belief for life in this movement. It is total in wanting to suppress and to sweep away freedoms. And so you, viewers, you have to make a choice about this issue. You cannot have this information and walk away and do nothing. As you heard the doctor, silence is complicity. You have a role to play in the fight for life in Jamaica and the Caribbean. One thing you can do, call Minister of Foreign Affairs. Call Senator Minister Kavina Johnson and say, as a citizen of this nation, you are asking her to sign that Geneva Consensus Declaration for Life. It is simply saying what is in Jamaican law already. We're simply saying, Minister of Foreign Affairs, write what is already in Jamaican law. So you have a role to play, citizen. But also, do you know any girls or women in crisis? Can you come alongside to offer help, encouragement, support, moral and material support, so that she can choose life for herself and for her child? You can do something, viewer. You can do something. And all of us together mobilize. This is how we have a movement towards life in our nation. So thank you for coming this evening. It continues next week, Wednesday, the 17th of March, same time, 5:30, where we'll be looking next week at the psychological costs of abortion. We've had the social, medical, we've looked at freedom of conscience. Next week, the psychological cost of abortion. Our presenters will be Dr. David Reardon and Dr. Priscilla Coleman, and Mrs. Stephanie Christian, who is from Jamaica, a psychologist and counselor, who will speak about helping women who are thinking about abortion or post-abortive women and men. Thank you so much for joining in. Let me just check in with Sarah if there are any final comments or questions from social media before we close our proceedings for this evening.
Well, thank you, Philippa. It was really a good program. Unfortunately, I guess because it's midweek, there was not really much activity, but we shall continue. The content is here, and
Absolutely.
I believe our guests actually did a great job in highlighting a lot of the things that we need to look out for here in Jamaica. So again, we invite you next week to come on back, 5:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. as we look about the psychological cost of abortion.
Wonderful, thank you. And Sarah, could we just ask your dad to close our session then with prayer? Mr. Buckland.
Let us pray. Father in heaven, we give you thanks for these guests that have sacrificed their time and their energies to be with us in this webinar. We give you thanks for the information that they've shared with us, for what we have learned from them and discussed. We thank you especially for the doctor in Poland and in Argentina who stood up for life and have been subjected both to persecution and prosecution. May their example motivate the rest of us that no matter what, we will stand up for life. We pray a blessing, O Lord, upon these webinars, that it will be effective. It is for your glory and honor. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, viewers. Until we meet again, God bless.
Right.